Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads. My name is Aryeh Cohen-Wade. I'm the managing editor of Blogging Heads. And today my guest is Lindsay. Why don't you introduce yourself, Lindsay?
Hi, I'm Lindsay Beyerstein. I'm an investigative journalist in Brooklyn, New York, and a huge fan of Serial. I've published two stories about the journalistic processes and twists and turns in the case, one in the Columbia Journalism Review and one in the New York Observer.
Great. So that's what we're going to be talking about today. So some people who were perhaps stranded on desert islands and are just getting back now may not have heard about what Serial is, or may have heard about it and are not listening. Most of this conversation, we're going to assume either you have listened to everything, including the episode that was released today, Thursday, the 4th of December, or that you're interested enough just to listen to it. Anyway, but for people who don't know anything about this, the podcast Serial, could you briefly explain what it is and give kind of a summary of the story?
Serial is a This American Life radio nonfiction broadcast, one story told week by week. And the story in question this season is the story of Adnan Syed, who is a Baltimore teenager who was convicted of murdering his girlfriend, Hae Min Lee, in 1999. And Sarah Koenig was a reporter for the Baltimore Sun in Baltimore around that era. And eventually she was brought into the case by people that wanted to complain about Adnan's defense attorney and her mishandling of various things. So she's investigating this, interviewing Adnan from jail, going back, interviewing everybody he knew from his high school, his friends, his parents, his people in his religious community, and just trying to get to the bottom of the case.
Right. And so it's a podcast, and I believe it's serialpodcast.org. Is that the URL?
I believe so, yeah.
And you can subscribe to it in iTunes or any other way you usually get a podcast. First episode aired on the radio as a This American Life episode, but the rest have just been over podcast form. And it's really kind of a revolution of the genre and of nonfiction or journalism in general. It has elements of new journalism, but the serial aspect to it, harks back to Charles Dickens and serialized stories from. Serialized fiction from the 19th century. So, I think you called it the best podcast ever in one of your articles.
And I believe it. It's really masterful, and I think it's fascinating because it's a quasi open-ended investigation that they're telling the story as they continue to investigate and chase down leads. They started their process, Sarah Koenig and her team, with thousands of pages of documents from the two trials that Adnan had and a bunch of background information, but they're still going on as they produce the radio show, continuing to interview people and chase down leads. And they've said they have some idea of how it's going to end, but they're not making any promises because real life isn't predictable and they don't know exactly what they're going to find before they decide to wrap the story.
Right. And that's one thing I want to touch on later, how this might possibly end and what listeners are expecting. But another thing to emphasize is that Sarah Koenig and her team has been reporting on the story for a year or so, but they say they're making each episode basically week by week. They have kind of a loose plan of what they want to do. They say they don't know exactly where it's going to end or how many episodes exactly they're going to be. The 10th episode just came out today. I think it was called "The Best Defense is a Good Defense" or something like that. So why don't we jump right in? We will be spoiling. If you haven't watched or you haven't listened to Serial, you have to start at the beginning. It's like a Charles Dickens novel. She lays it all out. And so if you're interested, I would highly recommend it. It might be the best podcast ever. I obviously am the managing editor of a website that produces podcasts, so I've kind of a rooting interest in the genre. But it's really good if you have any interest in crime, interesting storytelling. If you like This American Life, go to the website and start at the beginning and check it out. But from now on, we'll be kind of assuming you're up to date, and we will be, discussing freely. So, what did you think of the latest installment?
I thought the latest installment was well crafted, but not the most exciting episode of Serial that we've seen to date. Mm-hmm. The plot was investigating the quality of Adnan's defense at his trials. He had this attorney, Christina Gutierrez, who was something of a legend in Baltimore criminal defense circles before she took the case, but she had a kind of health crisis as she was handling this trial, and things went downhill pretty precipitously. But, I mean, I did think it was interesting that Sarah Koenig was kind of playing with our expectations, because we'd heard the worst of this attorney in little snippets of the series going forward. And we're sort of assuming, oh my God, this was total ineffective assistance of counsel. Obviously, he's going to deserve a new trial just for that. And she says, no, not really. I mean, she did some good things. She did some bad things. Clearly, she was thinking and trying,
right?
Which is important as a legal standard, because you have to be a really bad lawyer before a court will say, that somebody deserves a new trial or some kind of consideration because they didn't have a good enough lawyer.
Right. And I think one of the most surprising things from this episode was Adnan saying that he thought she did a good job. Adnan, the central figure who claims his innocence, and the investigation certainly shows there's a lot of problems with the case. He says his lawyer did a good job. That really surprised me. I've shown at least that there were some deficiencies in the way she argued the case, especially the way the jury kind of understood what she was doing. Do you think, and then, of course, one of the most interesting things about the podcast is new events are coming in real time, and Koenig can discuss them as they're happening. There's been some kind of appeal granted in Adnan's case relating to deficiency in his representation, but one specific aspect about whether he was offered a plea deal or not. Do you know anything more about that or have any thoughts on that?
I believe they said that it was a continuation of an ongoing appeal process that had been started, and essentially they're arguing that key facts about Jay's plea bargain were not disclosed to the defense at the time of the trial when they could have done something about it. So they're arguing that they deserve some sort of relief based on that. Mm-hmm. And I think the hearing is coming up on January 14th. So it wasn't something that happened because of Serial, unlike the Innocence Project investigation at the University of Virginia, which really was sparked by Sarah Koenig bringing her dossiers over there and sitting down with Deirdre Enright and just inspiring her to put her students on the case.
Right. So listeners of Serial may know that about episode 6, 7, or 8, Sarah goes to the Innocence Project, who take on cold cases that seem like they're possibly mishandled, and the person who's convicted is not guilty. And a lot of times these cases involve DNA evidence where the technology wasn't available, 25 years ago when this person was originally convicted, and a team of, lawyers and law students will, take on the case. And I guess, is there just one Innocence Project, or are there multiple ones?
I think it's an overall umbrella name, and then different law schools have their own chapters.
Right. So at least a couple hundred people have been exonerated by the various innocence projects across the country. So one of the things I kind of wanted to do in this conversation was, Slate has a podcast about the Serial podcast. So I wanted to mention the Slate podcast, so that this could be a podcast about a podcast about a podcast. And they really complained about that episode, the Innocence Project episode. They thought it was kind of boring. It didn't further the storyline. I thought it was really good, and it was really the first time up to that point that we got a perspective on the case that wasn't filtered through Sarah Koenig. And immediately the lawyers at the Innocence Project were questioning. We're saying this doesn't look right. There are definitely things to investigate. This seems like a really weak case against Adnan. So, that is kind of an interesting, real world effect of the reporting, shaping how this case is playing out and affecting Adnan's, possible exoneration.
I thought it was a really great plot twist that they got the Innocence Project involved. And I interviewed Deirdre Enright. She's as interesting and nice and warm a person as Sarah Koenig says. But I didn't like the structure of the show, because it gave the Innocence Project a lot of time to say what's true in criminal defense cases generally. They recorded it before they really had anything to go on. And so narratively, it felt like they took 45 minutes to establish something that could have been established in essentially a soundbite, that, hey, the Innocence Project thinks there's enough here. And to a lot of people, myself included, even though I'm the kind of true believer who thinks everybody's innocent, generally speaking, and roots for the criminal defense, it felt like sort of grandstanding. And it felt like rhetorical. It didn't feel evidential. And they couldn't be very evidential at that point because they didn't have very much to go on.
Right.
But it felt more like just giving time for advocacy for the defense in a way that they didn't really do for the prosecution in the previous episode.
That's interesting. One of the aspects I would like to discuss further is, this is a podcast. This American Life where it comes from, it's a show that has true stories, sometimes it has fiction, but it's primarily entertainment. It's not usually, they do some, breaking news stories, but, it's primarily something you listen to enjoy, not get as a primary source of news. So each episode of Serial, they want to keep us listening and keep it interesting. And, it's kind of strange to say entertaining when you're thinking about a case where an actual young woman was murdered, and there's some disturbing aspects of kind of how people are reacting to the case online. But, each episode has to be crafted to keep you listening and keep you interested. And so I think sometimes, they're shaping the episodes, kind of the overall plot to keep us wanting more, even though
definitely,
that might not be the best way to talk about the truth. So why don't we talk about one of the, I guess one other thing that I thought was an interesting aspect that was kind of a mystery lingering out there was why there were two trials. And it was revealed in this latest episode that there was a mistrial, and it was kind of split between the fault of the judge and Adnan's lawyer, Gutierrez. There was, kind of a minor dispute about whether a piece of evidence had been shared, and the Gutierrez said she hadn't seen she hadn't had a chance to look at it. Something that was introduced by the prosecution, and the judge said, "You're lying." And I guess the jurors kind of half heard this, and one of the jurors sent a note.
And she completely flew off the handle.
Yeah, and one of the jurors sent a note saying, "Oh, well, you've said that the lawyer is a liar. Should we not listen to her anymore? Does she have to leave?" So obviously, the jury was kind of contaminated by the judge saying you're lying. So it was kind of equally to blame between the judge and Gutierrez. But according to Koenig and other people, it seemed like the first trial went a lot better than the second trial. And, it's just crazy to think that this one little minor thing, could have completely changed this story. And if there hadn't been a mistrial, we can't know what happened, but it's possible that Adnan would have been found innocent, and there would be no podcast called Serial. And, it's all turning on this one very minor piece of evidence. So that was just, just kind of a crazy aspect of it to me.
Underscores the randomness and, letting 12 regular people decide somebody's guilt or innocence.
Yeah, and
who they are does matter.
Yeah, and the things we've heard from the jurors don't especially add to, confidence in the jury process. This is kind of a classic thing, but, they focus on, this guy seemed like a nice young man and that kind of stuff. So, she's definitely exposing parts of the criminal justice system that we don't usually want to think about and are somewhat disturbing. So why don't we move on to something that you've written about, a lot of other people have written about, and I think this episode in a way kind of answered, which is race and the podcast. So Sarah Koenig is white. Heyman Lee, the victim, was Korean American. Adnan Syed is Pakistani American. Jay, we don't know his last name. The person who testified against Adnan that he helped dispose of Hayes' body is African American. The defense attorney, Gutierrez, may be Hispanic, or she passed away, but for certain her last name indicates that she may have been Hispanic. So, we have a rainbow coalition of figures here. And some people online have kind of objected to how race is presented in Serial, and you took objection to those objections. So why don't you kind of briefly lay out the objections and then say why you think they're wrong?
Okay, well, the sort of seminal objection to the dealings of Serial with race was a piece by J. Caspian Kang in The Awl, and he argued that Serial was this white reporter trampling with white privilege all over these communities of color and getting them completely wrong. And I don't think that he was. I don't think he made a strong case for that. And I don't think anybody's come forward since to make a strong case that Sarah Koenig was misportraying the Muslim community of Baltimore or misportraying Korean Americans. It was, for instance, one of the example that Kang led with was the Heyman Lee's diary, which was introduced into evidence. And so Sarah Koenig was able to read all 63 pages of it. And she said, I don't really know what I was expecting, but it was such a teenage girl's diary. Mm-hmm. And Kang just immediately jumps to the conclusion in his text that this must be because she has biases about what Koreans are like or what Korean people's diaries are like. And there was nothing at all in any episode of the podcast then or ever subsequently to suggest that it had anything particular. Her reaction to this somewhat weird boy crazy diary had anything to do with any thoughts about what Korean people's diaries are like.
Yeah, I wish I could kind of present the case that Kang and one other writer for BuzzFeed, his name I can't remember, presented, but I read both those pieces and was kind of dumbstruck by them. Yeah, I mean, the obvious interpretation of what she said was that, this seems like a classic murder mystery. You have the victim's diary. It's going to reveal all. But actually, it's just the average diary of kind of a, more or less average teenage girl, expressing the things that the average teenage girl would express. So I think that's really what Koenig was saying there, that the diary was not the key to the entire case, which happens in fiction, but probably doesn't happen very often in reality.
Sure.
And I think so there's been kind of a semi-backlash to Serial, and you wrote a pretty good rejoinder. Connor Friedersdorf, who is a fellow Blogging Heads contributor at The Atlantic, also wrote a long piece kind of critiquing the piece by Kang and others, defending Serial. I really think, considering the unusual racial dynamics that are in the case where you have different immigrant communities, Baltimore, a city with many African Americans, a white reporter, I think they're really doing about as good a job as possible. The thing that, it's hard to speculate about people's motives, but I think the thing that's missing really is the voice of, hey, the victim. Obviously, we can't have her voice because she was murdered. And her family, it sounds like her parents possibly don't speak English. And Sarah Koenig reports that she tried very, very hard to get in contact with these people. It sounds like maybe she found some of them, but they were not interested in participating. So his voice and the voice of her family is really absent. When we hear Adnan's voice, we hear Jay's voice from his testimony and from his interrogation with the police. So I think, that's just kind of a fault of the way this unusual case is progressing. The Korean-American central character is a murder victim, so we can't really hear, there's no recordings of her, and we don't really get her family's perspective because they didn't agree to cooperate with the project.
But race and religion and ethnicity are very much in the top text of Serial. This is something Sarah Koenig has obviously thought about a lot. And basically the first two episodes of the podcast are establishing how certain kinds of Islamophobic tropes help put Adnan in jail.
Right.
And then in this most recent episode, they revisited that by talking about all the crazy Islamophobic arguments that were brought up when they were trying to set bail for Adnan. And she went back and talked to the jury and basically teased out of them that, yes, they did have certain beliefs about what those Muslim men are like with their women that came up in the jury deliberation room. So she talks to Adnan's parents, who make really strong claims where they're saying, well, the only reason they went after my child is because he's Muslim. And Sarah Koenig says right out, I don't believe that, but it's really obvious also that his religion and ethnicity played a big part in how he was prosecuted and how things played out for him.
Yeah, definitely. I was kind of shocked by the explicit racism of the prosecutor in the bail hearing. It was a little unclear to me whether he actually got bail or not in the end. Did you catch that?
I did not. I don't think they said in the episode.
Right. So the prosecutor repeatedly calls him a Pakistan male, I think, instead of a Pakistani male, a Pakistan male, and makes this, very overtly racist and anti-Muslim argument that, Muslim men abuse women, and he's, if you let him out on bail, he can easily escape to Pakistan and we'll never get him again. And
all his friends and neighbors who came to court to say, we'll supervise them, we'll put up our own houses as collateral, in this prosecutor's telling of it, were just proof that the entire Muslim community was going to ship him out to Pakistan and, lose their houses in the process. I'm not sure how that was supposed to work, but she construed these people as the Muslim horde menace instead of the supportive community who believes in this guy 100%.
Yeah, it was pretty shocking. And I mean, for people who are kind of sniffing around for racial insensitivities, I mean, here's your obvious racist, Islamophobic, however you want to put it, government employee who, it was
just pandering to people's worst fears.
Yeah, it was pretty awful. It was almost unbelievable. And
then they got the science teacher up on the stand to say that Adnan was stoked about the fact that they sacrificed an animal at their mosque, and that he claimed to have an uncle in Pakistan who could make people disappear.
Yeah.
And we're thinking, whoa, you guys are scraping the bottom of the barrel here.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess when a prosecutor, their job is to find every piece of evidence that could possibly convict the person that they think did it. So from their perspective, they had the best of intentions. They were trying to, convict a murderer, but it was, very surprising. Do you have anything else you want to add about the kind of racial subtext or, foretext of Serial?
Another interesting kind of top text thing that they get into is the fact that Jay is black, and it was a majority black jury. It was 7 out of the 12, and it seemed pretty clear that Jay was resonating and connecting with the jury on a very personal level. And it's hard to ignore the fact that possibly, I mean, they didn't come out and say it themselves, the jurors, and there's no direct evidence of this, but Sarah Koenig definitely seems to take the possibility seriously that a majority black jury in Baltimore might be more sympathetic to the prosecution's star African-American witness, who does come off as a very nice, charming, intelligent kid on the stand. He was a tour de force by Jay, by all accounts,
right,
in terms of him testifying against Adnan. And Adnan never took the stand himself, which is common in murder cases, but it did leave this huge vacuum because they never got to know him as a person. So maybe all they were left with were stereotypes and fears.
Right. And I think something very effective from the last episode was, and I was even surprised that this was recorded for posterity, all the members of the jury pool who the judge instructs them to come up and talk to him if they've been a victim of a crime themselves, or had a family member victim of a crime, or a family member who committed a crime, or it was mostly a homicide related crime, and they just played these regular people saying, oh, my brother is in jail for murder, or I was robbed 3 months ago, and this is kind of the general population of Baltimore County, I guess. But that was just very striking, kind of as a sociological snapshot of the tough lives that people live in Baltimore, and also how the criminal justice system works.
Also, I think sort of what people were familiar with and what they might have been using to judge Jay's credibility, because you see a lot of podcast listeners who come, I'm assuming, from much more privileged backgrounds, where they don't have this kind of day-to-day experience of having been a criminal defendant, knowing criminal defendants, knowing people that, knowing people who sell drugs or have been accused of selling drugs. And to them, Jay reads as this horrifying scumbag, and it reads them as a total miscarriage of justice, and, oh, what a dumb jury, how could they have been taken in by him? We know all this stuff about his bad background. Clearly you shouldn't trust a person like that. And I think the jurors may have been coming at it with a very different experiences, like, oh, well, yeah, you've been accused of selling drugs, big deal, so is everybody.
Right, yeah, that's a great point that I hadn't really thought of before, how much the milieu could have affected their view of Jay, who I think actually at one point they interview a juror who talks about how I think she calls him like street smart or something. So, even though he was an admitted drug dealer, they kind of saw him more as like a neighborhood character kind of guy, whereas we're getting a very different portrait of Jay from Sarah Koenig and other people. Why don't we? And
they may have been right. I mean, I think the juror. I was sympathetic to the idea that the jurors were swayed by Jay, that he got up there and he gave a good performance,
right,
and was coherent and polite and not swayed by extremely, aggressive cross-examination.
Yeah.
And they weren't maybe as biased as some other people in the community by saying, well, if you're a drug dealer, if you're this, if you're that, you must be a scumbag and you should never believe anything you say.
Right. And it seems clear that Adnan's lawyer did not do a good job of trying to get Jay to trip up, even though there's obvious inconsistencies that Sarah Koenig has pointed out between his things he said under interrogation, things he said in, I think, the 2 separate trials. There are things he said that don't line up. And it really seems like one of Gutierrez's biggest failures was kind of, just the way she approached questioning him, obviously didn't work, and the jurors believed him and not the story that she tried to tell otherwise. Although, as Koenig pointed out, her defense was someone else did it, and trying to establish who that someone else is very difficult. So why don't we jump to that? I mean, what do you? So this is a kind of it's a mystery story. It's a whodunit. We have the person in jail is the person who was convicted, and the state of Maryland says did it. But Sarah Koenig raises a lot of questions about whether that's true. So, do you think Adnan did it?
As a factual matter, yes, I do. If I had to make a bet, did Adnan kill Hae Min Lee, I would say yes.
Really? Okay, that's interesting.
As a matter of law, I mean, did the state prove that case beyond a reasonable doubt? I'm thinking less and less that they did.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
Because of all the inconsistencies in Jay's statement, I mean, I'm inclined to believe, as Sarah Koenig says, the basic structure of his story doesn't change, and he knew some things about the crime amazingly fast. Like, as soon as he got out of Adnan's car on the night of the murder, he said to his friend, Hae is dead, buried, and strangled. He knew all those things the night she disappeared, and they turned out to be true. Mm-hmm. He had the shovels and picks that Jen helped him dispose. So he was really close to the crime. He led the police to Hae's car.
Wait, so you're talking about Jay now?
Yeah.
Not Adnan?
No, not Adnan. So this is Jay's being really close to the crime.
Right.
So, he clearly knew what he was talking about. And that story of Adnan saying, I killed my girlfriend, and Jay helping him cover up was consistent and compelling to me. Mm-hmm. Even though, having read the transcripts of Jay's interrogations, and goodness knows what they actually did to him off tape. But even on tape, you can really see how the police are kind of spoiling him as a witness, because they clearly want certain things and they're leading him. But that doesn't mean that he has nothing to offer them. They're trying to groom him and gild this lily, because he's got a pretty good story about why Adnan's guilty. But they want premeditation, so they keep pushing him to say, oh yeah, Adnan told me further and further before, and made more and more plans. It's more and more premeditated. And of course, it was 6 weeks after the events in question, and then the police showed him on his second interview the cell phone records, and they really needed those cell phone records to come up with to generate a coherent timeline, so that Jay could explain what he and Adnan were doing, bumming around Baltimore County all afternoon on the day that Hae disappeared. And it just seems to me that they may have had misconceptions about what the cell phone data could prove in the first place, and they're leaning very heavily on this, confused kid who's alone without a lawyer in a room, and knows that he's talking because he wants to get out of being in trouble. Mm-hmm. And so he shows up and he talks to the police the first time, and the police tell him, that's great, but what will really get you out of trouble is if you dig yourself in deeper and admit that this is a premeditated murder that you're an accessory to. And Jay's just kind of lapping it up. And I feel like these kinds of leading questions that weren't well designed to get at the truth created this interconnected, crazy, confusing, incoherent web of stuff. If the cops had just stuck to good interviewing, truth-seeking questions, they were being good by the standards of detectives. But if they'd stuck to more open-ended questions, they probably could have gotten a story that was a lot clearer and more convincing from Jay, instead of trying to force him to fit their electronic evidence narrative.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so that's interesting. So you are more of a serial superfan than I am. So you have read the interrogation logs of Jay's interrogation, things that have not been presented on the Serial podcast. So you have a lot more information than I do. I'll just say I guess I kind of agree with you that it seems like the case the state presented could not really have happened as they say it happened. I'm about 99.9% sure of that. There's just too many, inconsistencies. And I'm pretty sure that Adnan didn't do it. Obviously I can't know. And that's kind of what the whole series is about, whether he did or not. It just, he just seems, it just doesn't seem to work for me. It seems like there should have been, DNA evidence that could have been tested if he did do it. But then, of course, you have the question, who did do it, and how did Jay know where Hae's car was? And
what motive would Jay have? I mean, the fact that Jay knew where the car was sort of discounts for me the random sexual predator theory.
Right.
And
so why don't you explain that a little bit more? There's been a lot of speculation online that there are people who are kind of serial killers or serial rapists out there who targeted Asian American women, and there's internet sleuths are kind of focusing on these possible
there are
people.
At least two people who they know of who are known sex offenders, rapists. I think one case murderer, and who had targeted victims of a similar profile, similar modus operandi, that kind of thing, and their DNA is in a database of offenders. So there was an untested PERC kit, physical evidence kit, off of Hayes' body that has swabs from her body that might be able to find DNA from someone. And obviously, if one of these convicted sex offenders, if they bring up a hit on that, then it would pretty much exonerate Adnan and Jay, unless there was some really super backstory. But
yeah, and prior to doing this last night, I re-listened to Serial episode 1 because when I first listened to it, I kind of obviously wasn't committed yet, and kind of parts I wasn't really paying close attention to. And at the very end, Koenig teases some audio clips from the this season on Serial, and there's a couple things that still haven't appeared.
I think I know which ones you're talking about.
And there's ones of some, it's unclear who's talking. Someone saying, was it a setup? And someone else saying, well, we're running out of suspects. So it seems like there's still more to be revealed. She originally said they thought around 12 episodes would constitute the series. There's been 10 already, and it seems like they're at the halfway point, maybe, if things are still going to be introduced further. So obviously we don't have everything that they have. And that's actually something I wanted to discuss with you, kind of from a, both a listener perspective and kind of a media ethics perspective. This is serial storytelling, nonfiction storytelling in a way that really hasn't been done before. They've been researching the story for a year, but they're doling it out in weekly, hour-long segments. They know more than we do, and they're giving way more transparency than you usually get in journalism. And we're hearing what Sarah Koenig thinks about individual aspects of the case, and she's doubting herself. But at the same time, she's not being totally honest with us because she knows things that haven't yet been revealed in order to further the excitement of the plot, or keep it going for hours at a time. So what do you think of that aspect of it?
I wouldn't necessarily describe it as dishonesty. I mean, this is a long form piece of journalism, and imagine if this were a true crime book. I mean, some of the most famous true crime books involve, for instance, Joe McGinnis's Fatal Vision is the story of how he fell in bromance with Jeffrey McDonald, the Fort Bragg Green Beret murderer, and thought he was innocent, signed all this paperwork to write a sympathetic biography, and eventually became convinced by the forensic evidence that no, this guy is a psychopathic murderer. And it wasn't hippies that broke into his house and killed his family after all. A huge leap, I know. But anyway, if you were reading the book, for the first half of the book, you think, oh, Joe McGinnis thinks Jeff McDonald is an innocent man, the great guy. Right. But in fact, when he submitted that manuscript, long before he submitted that manuscript, he decided that he was going to tell the story of Jeff McDonald being guilty. And I don't have a problem with that. I mean, it's a long-form work. And if people insist on drawing conclusions midway through, that's their risk to take. Right. And if you want to be more conservative and wait until the entire evidence is in, that serials, I mean, a journalist always knows more than they put in because it's just impossible to shoehorn all of reality into any kind of coherent story. So there's always going to be stuff left out and choices that are made. So I don't really have a problem with that either. And I also feel better about this. I might worry about it more if this was a case that was being adjudicated right now, where people might be tempted to make life or death decisions, freedom or jail decisions based on this partial story that's unfolding. But this is a done deal for the most part. That really, anything that could happen to Adnan, it's all up here for him. The more people who know about him, the better. Whether we're getting entirely the whole story from week to week, it's raised his profile. This is just all gravy for him because he had 2 trials. He went to jail. He's in jail. He's had a bunch of appeals. None of them have gone anywhere. And this is basically his last ditch. So I don't think that there's anything that telling the story in installments is really going to hurt and could only help. And if he is innocent, that could be a wonderful help. It could be a great thing for society at large and for him. Right.
I guess the difference between this and, a long-form piece of journalism is the piece of journalism is finished. And the end, if you're reading a nonfiction true crime book and you want to find out who really did it, you can skip to the end and see who the journalist thinks really did do it. And, we can't skip to the end yet. And, this serial form of storytelling that's kind of what makes it so fascinating. And we're tuning in every week, Thursday morning, eagerly, refreshing iTunes, waiting for it to come in. Yeah. It makes it extra compelling. But I think there are some kind of, I guess I'm slightly more troubled by the idea that, Sarah Koenig is doling things out for narrative purposes, but, they've really done a masterful job, so I guess I'll trust her in
And
the
I
end.
think, I really get the sense, I interviewed her producer, and I believe what they've been saying, which is that they're not that much further ahead of us than, not as far ahead as one might think. I mean, this really is legitimately open-ended. And if you want to, I think that's a responsible way to view it, is this is an open-ended investigation. And this is where they're at this week. So don't go flying off the handle because the investigation's not done.
Right.
And they've warned you in advance. We go back and forth. We started this process before we reached that equilibrium point that all reporters investigating tested things usually reach, which is, you sort of you get to that tipping point where it's like, okay, I'm going to come down on one side or the other. But there's always this back and forth during the investigative process. And essentially they pulled the screen back and said, we're going to show you the backstory. We're going to show you the thought process of reporters as they're investigating the story. And I think we can treat it as a work in progress and an incomplete work, and just, accept, to the extent that the text validates this, that they're engaged in honest and open-ended inquiry, and they're not trying to tell us this is the settled truth. This is where we are now.
Right. So you mentioned people, jumping to conclusions midway through. I don't know. I think the internet is probably the best place for people to jump to conclusions without having all the facts. So this story has inspired, people on Reddit and people in general to do their own investigations. Obviously, you've looked into it more than the average listener has, interviewing some of the people involved and reading transcripts and stuff. And, I think there was a recent piece in Slate by Willa Paskin where she kind of talked about this as kind of obsession, and there's kind of the internet is obsessed with getting obsessed about things. But, this is multiple people have compared Serial to True Detective, the last, a recent thing.
It was like all the obsessive fan energy just transferred over seamlessly.
Right.
It went from the Yellow King to Adnan Syed like nothing had happened.
Yeah, and I think there were probably some
I was an obsessive True Detective fan, too.
Yeah, I was, too.
For the record.
And I think I'll mention True Detective when we talk about how Serial could possibly end. But, of course, the difference here is that this is nonfiction. True Detective is fiction. Pretty much everything else the internet becomes obsessed with in this kind of weird way. It previously has been fiction, and so wild speculation doesn't harm anyone. In this case, there are real people involved, a real young woman who was murdered, and real people who could possibly be libeled by being accused of murder when the state did not think they were the ones who did it. And, people on the internet are researching other people's real lives. It kind of reminds me a little bit of what happened after the Boston bombing, where people on Reddit started, searching through crowd photographs and finding people who had backpacks, and these unfortunate young pair of people who were running the race who had large backpacks ended up on the cover of the New York Post because people on Reddit thought they looked suspicious, and of course Reddit was completely wrong about.
And then there was that poor philosophy student who committed suicide that they also blamed.
Right. Yeah, so, the hive mind...
He didn't commit suicide because of it. That all happened after he disappeared and was presumably dead, so that's not on Reddit. But
right.
It was just a tragedy and piling on to what his family was already going through.
Yeah, so obviously, this kind of having fun on the internet can affect real people's lives and add real grief to, the grief they're already experiencing. What do you think of kind of the online reaction to this and, people treating this like it's... Because, it's like better than fiction. It seems like, if this story was fiction, it would be, unbelievable almost. What do you think of this whole world that's developed?
The subreddit, which is kind of the epicenter of this from the fan perspective that I know of, has been really good. They've got a big disclaimer, and it's actively moderated, where they say, don't use real last names if they haven't been used in the broadcast. Don't post any personally identifying details. Don't post addresses or phone numbers or anything like that. We'll delete you, and if you keep doing it, we'll ban you. And I think that they've set a good tone. There's a lot of sort of fevered speculation, but I feel like when you talk to people, and I'm involved in a couple of these groups in various settings, people are doing this in a serious spirit. People are not just standing back and laughing and making up crazy theories. Even people who are arguing for the craziest theories really think that they're putting forward something that could help the cause of justice. And most of them are full of it, and it's not worthwhile. And but there are some some things that have come forward that have been very worthwhile. The users who've taken the time who are cell phone engineers have taken the time to actually create accurate maps and analyses of what the cell phone data really mean, and maps of the terrain, people using Google Earth, so you can get a interactive view of what the crime scene was like, what the geography was like. There's just been a lot of creativity and constructive stuff. So there's a lot of loose talk, but that happens about any high profile story.
Right.
That it's not unique to Serial. And I think people, for all my creative excesses in terms of thinking about this case, it really is in a spirit of wanting to help or wanting to confirm that justice was done.
And so I have not delved into Reddit, the subreddit about Serial. What have people found, who are not Sarah Koenig and her team? What else has been kind of revealed through other online sources about the case that an interested viewer might want to know?
There's some really interesting blogs. There's an evidence law professor. People share links to stuff that they find on the internet. And there's some really interesting people who are making commentary, including Rabia Chowdhury, who's the leader of the Free Adnan contingent. She's got a blog. I think it's called Splitting the Moon. And she's been posting from her vast trove of trial documents. So she posted the Jay and Jen interrogation sessions. There's this guy I think he calls himself the evidence blog prof or something like that, who's written 7 or 8 incredibly detailed posts about the Maryland rules of evidence and how they should or shouldn't have been applied in this case. You can really geek out on that. They've got transcripts. I think they're user sourced. I think people just work on them and post them for free as Google Docs on the sidebar of the subreddit. So if you want to go back and check any of the dialogue or anything like that, they've got really good transcripts that allow you to do that. They've got, they have occasionally people who are involved in the case will come and do an Ask Me Anything.
Right. And that's where someone who said they were, it's hard to tell, someone who said they were Hayes' brother, the victim in this case, Heyman Lee, her brother posted on Reddit that he had been contacted by Sarah Koenig, and it was unclear if he ever actually responded, but did not consent to an interview, either through lack of response or saying not interested. That's just, it's hard to imagine what someone in that position would, how they would take this entire, phenomenon of your sibling being murdered, and then 15 years later, everyone suddenly knows who she is. It would have to be bizarre. But that's kind of... Sure.
And reading that, I don't know the extent to which it has been authenticated. The sort of going consensus is that it's real. But I can't vouch for that. But just reading it really hit home for me about how much, it really, how this is affecting real people.
Yeah, and I guess that's kind of what I wanted to get through, that, speculating about who the Yellow King was just all in good fun. But I'm glad to hear what you said, that the Reddit is being kind of actively moderated and people are, taking this seriously and not kind of just treating it as the same as they would in a fictional story. And
I'm not aware of anybody, I don't have an exhaustive knowledge of this, but I'm not aware of anybody who's gone off and bothered anybody in real life or anything like that. There haven't been reports of that. So, I think people are respecting the line between Sarah Koenig's journalism and their lives.
Yeah, that's good. And there's certainly been a lot
and keep it up, guys. Keep doing that.
Yeah, and there's certainly been some disturbing stories recently in the media about people being targeted and having their personal lives exposed for saying something unpopular in various realms. So let's see, what should we talk about next? I guess I'm going to bring up my pet theory of the case, which, like I said before, this seems so much like a classical detective story, and there's things you think would happen if this was fiction, but of course it's not fiction. You kind of have to keep reminding yourself. Jay is the obvious suspect. If this were an episode of Law and Order, Jay would be the obvious other suspect. And there's the one point where I thought Sarah Koenig may have tipped her hand was she mentions when she's talking to the woman from the Innocence Project, wondering whether Adnan was a charming psychopath. And, because one of the big themes of the show is how he seems like such a nice guy, and how could he possibly do this? And all of his friends testified that, there's no way he could possibly do this. And some people thought that Jay would be the kind of person who would be, tangled up in this kind of case. And the woman from the Innocence Project says, you're not going to get the charming psychopath on your first try. Like, there's just not that many of them out there. It's just not going to happen. And then in the episode that's about Jay, called The Deal with Jay, on the previously on, the little summary of things that happened in previous episodes, the first thing they play in that episode is that quote about the charming psychopath. And there's no more reference to that. They were talking about Adnan, and this is the episode about Jay. And so, if this were a fictional story, I would, the obvious thing is that Jay's guilty and Jay is the charming psychopath.
But that's also equally unlikely. I think what's more likely is that they're both pretty regular kids. And I mean, domestic violence is real. Intimate partner violence is real. I mean, the thing about, and sometimes it's unknown. I mean, it's the kind of thing that's stigmatized and hidden, and it's not totally beyond the realm of possibility that either it started and was really severe, or that things had been going on that nobody wanted to talk about or nobody realized. And I mean, it's a cliche that you should look at the boyfriend or the husband when a woman is murdered, but it's also backed up probabilistically. And a lot of the people that champion Adnan's innocence stress the lack of motive, and they're right. I mean, they'd broken up. The general consensus is that they'd broken up amicably. It doesn't really make a lot of sense that he would suddenly want to go and be violent towards her. But anything that you can say that's weak about Adnan's motive, it goes double for Jay. He and Hay didn't really know each other. There was just no reason at all why Jay would kill Hay alone. I mean, you can maybe think of, the manipulation coming in earlier for some reason, him helping Adnan, but there's no way that I can really think, and I've thought it through a million times, there's no scenario in which Jay is motivated to kill Hay. I mean, people have said, oh, well, he was jealous of the fact that Adnan was close to Jay's beloved girlfriend, Stephanie. It's like, what are you talking about? You're mad at a guy, so you go and kill his ex-girlfriend?
Right. Now, I'll have to mention the podcast about a podcast against Slate, Slate's serial podcast. They floated a theory that Hay knew or suspected that Jay was cheating on his girlfriend. His name is Jen. Is that right?
Oh, Jay's girlfriend is Stephanie.
Stephanie,
and Jen is like Jay's sidekick and best friend. And if you ask me, the entirely possible business partner in the narcotics industry, though there's no evidence of that in the podcast or direct evidence of that in any of the documents.
Right. So that's kind of the theory that they floated, that Hay said some people said that Hay he was going to confront Jay about cheating on his girlfriend, and he flipped out.
But how would Hay know about that? First of all, like, she's not close to either of those two people,
right?
And neither of them would be the sort of person who would confide in Hay about the fact that there were infidelities. And Hay didn't spend that much time with them, and she was, friends but not best friends with Stephanie. So it's like, well, why does she care that much that Jay is? Even if she somehow knew that Jay is cheating on Stephanie with Jen. And Jay and Jen were publicly best friends that winter, hanging out every single day. So everybody knew that they had a lot of alone time together, and anybody could speculate, including Stephanie, about what they were doing during that time. But I just don't, and if Hay were to see them together anywhere, nobody would think anything of it because they're openly, publicly best friends.
Okay, that's interesting. You've obviously thought about this and the various characters more than I have. It still seems, it's troubling because it doesn't seem to add up. It doesn't add up cleanly any way you slice it. I think that's why this is such an interesting case.
It's addictive because the case feels, I think the reason your mind keeps coming back to it is like your tongue to a broken tooth. It doesn't feel like it should be there. It doesn't feel like it works.
Yeah.
No matter what scenario, it feels like it's an impossible case. It's not just, well, which is more likely. It's like none of them is perfectly likely. None of them is totally possible that we can think of. There's something wrong with every one of them. Right.
And again, just comparing this to fiction again, why don't we talk about, what could possibly happen at the end of Serial? In a fictional murder mystery, the killer is revealed and often punished, sometimes gets off. And, the reader, the listener, the consumer feels a sense of completion and closure, and feels like, the journey was worth it through the twists and turns and red herrings, because we find out who really did it. And there's, a sense of catharsis even, finding out who the guilty party is at the end of an episode of Law and Order and seeing them convicted. I don't know what a good ending to Serial would be. I mean, the obvious one is that some piece of evidence is discovered by Sarah Koenig or the Innocence Project that shows that Adnan could not possibly do it. Someone else's DNA is there, some witness, some time-stamped video showing him in the library miraculously appears. Right, yeah, the handwritten card to sign out, using internet in the library in 1999 is found in a dusty warehouse somewhere.
All the President's Men library crime kind of moment.
Yeah, so, I mean, what and getting back to True Detective and other shows like this, I mean, this show is in some ways similar to Lost, telling us a serial story and a story that generates a lot of interest in theories. True Detective, Lost, both of those shows, a lot of people were disappointed when they ended. And this is different because this is real. I mean, what do you think? How could this end? Is there a satisfying ending? What do you think is going to happen?
Well, I mean, in theory, the DNA test could come back, but it's not going to come back in the time frame that we have episodes left in the series. If this season's going to be anywhere in the length that they think it's going to be, because they have to file a motion and have a judge rule on it, and then go to the tests. The tests themselves take 24 hours, and it would have to show something interesting. And I'm very skeptical that there's going to be DNA there, because there wasn't, to be kind of gross about it, there wasn't sperm that they could see in these swipes. So
right. There was no evidence. There was no evidence.
Is like nature's DNA juice, so like that makes it easy to get a DNA hit. So there might be DNA in the trace hits, and it might be somebody other than. I mean, if it turned out to be Adnan or Jay, that would be pretty earth-shattering and satisfying either way. But the idea that it's going to turn out to be some unknown serial sex offender who might be who happens to be in the database, so they'll get a hit, just doesn't seem that likely to be, either on the whole, or certainly it seems almost impossible that would happen during the time frame that they've set for this season.
Right. Yeah. That all makes sense. And, there was no evidence that Hay was raped. So that kind of DNA evidence doesn't seem like it's going to turn up. Yeah, I don't know how they're going to. I mean, they say they have kind of a sense of how they're going to end this, and they must have thought about it a lot. I don't know what they're going to do. I trust Sarah Koenig and her team, and I will continue to be listening. Do you have anything else you want to say about Serial in our remaining minutes?
I think that pretty much sums it up.
Yeah. So the one other thing I want to add is, have you heard the Serial Miley Cyrus mashup?
I have not.
Okay, I will send you the link, and I will post the link when this goes live on Blogging Heads. They mashed up the strangely compelling Serial theme song with Miley Cyrus Wrecking Ball. And it sounds really good.
Gotta check that out. Thanks.
Yeah, it's my wife and I have listened to it about 10 times already, because you hear those opening piano plinks and you're right in it, but then Miley Cyrus is singing. So it's hilarious, and a little fun thing in the midst of this story that has so many disturbing and tragic aspects. So Lindsay, thank you so much for coming on Blogging Heads and speaking to us about Serial. If our viewers have somehow watched this whole episode, even though they haven't been listening to Serial, I exhort you to listen to Serial. It's really amazing, and you'll definitely get hooked once you listen to the first episode. Maybe when they do wrap the show up in the next couple weeks, you could come back on and talk with me again about where it all ended up.
I would love to. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. Bye.
Bye.